My 8-year-old son had just come home from school, tired but smiling, like any other day. He carefully removed his prosthetic arm, something he relies on to do even the simplest of tasks, and placed it gently on the front porch while he went inside to change. It had become a small routine, safe, normal, but what happened next changed everything. Within minutes, 3 minutes to be exact, our neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, the head of the HOA, walked right up to our steps, looked down at that arm, and threw it into the trash bin like it was garbage. No hesitation, no guilt, just a muttered, "This is junk. Keep your broken stuff inside." That junk was my son's lifeline. She didn't know cameras were rolling. She didn't know we'd had enough. And she definitely didn't know the HOA was part of a federally regulated accessibility program, meaning her hateful little act wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. We filed a report with footage attached, and within 3 minutes, federal Marshals showed up at her door with a warrant. What happened after that? Let's just say the woman who thought she could throw away my son's dignity didn't realize she'd just thrown away her freedom. We moved into the neighborhood hoping for a quiet, stable life. A clean start after years of hospitals, surgeries, and painful adjustments that came after my son's accident. He was only 6 when it happened. A tragic car crash that took most of the function in his dominant arm and left us not only grappling with emotional trauma, but with the reality that he'd now need a prosthetic for everyday tasks. But kids are incredible. Resilient in ways we adults often aren't. By 8, he was thriving, playing, learning, adapting, smiling through it all. He named his prosthetic arm Titan, after a comic book hero he loved. It wasn't just a tool to him. It was a symbol of strength. He'd leave it on the porch sometimes when he got home, especially after a long school day when he wanted to cool off or run inside to grab a snack. It became part of our normal rhythm. And for months, everything seemed fine. The neighborhood was clean, calm, full of retirees, gardeners, and weekend barbecues. It had the kind of picturesque quiet we thought would help us all heal. But quiet, as we learned, doesn't always mean kind. Enter Karen. She introduced herself. On day 1, not with a plate of cookies, but with a printed packet of HOA guidelines. The first thing she said was, "We run a tight ship here, and we expect newcomers to respect that." I smiled, nodded, tried to extend friendliness. My son even waved and said, "Hi, I'm James." Karen looked at him, glanced at his arm, and gave a tight smile. "Just make sure he doesn't leave toys or equipment out front. We keep things tidy around here," she said, then turned and walked away. At first, I brushed it off. Not everyone is warm. Not everyone knows how to act around disability, but it was the first sign of something colder beneath her polished veneer. Over the weeks that followed, small things started happening. A note on our door about visual clutter after James left his soccer ball out overnight. An anonymous complaint about inappropriate yard objects when we put up a swing for him in the backyard. A conversation in passing where she told another neighbor within earshot that kids these days get too many exceptions just because they're a little different. It was subtle, calculated, almost hard to prove, and that's what made it dangerous. She had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, served as the HOA president for 6, and acted like the entire community was her private kingdom. She inspected trash bins, measured lawns, and took photos of violations to email with dramatic subject lines like, "Urgent non-compliance Lot 17. And while she was strict with everyone, it became increasingly clear that James bothered her in a different way. She hated that he played outside. She hated the sight of his prosthetic arm. I once heard her mutter to someone during a block party, "I understand the poor child's situation, but that thing makes the porch look like a hospital." That thing was a state-of-the-art prosthetic that had taken months to custom fit and years of therapy to master. It was a part of my son, and to Karen, it was an eyesore. Still, I held back. I didn't want to start drama. I didn't want to escalate things. I thought maybe, just maybe, if we kept to ourselves, followed the rules, and stayed polite, she'd back off. But people like Karen don't back off. They push boundaries until they break something, or someone. The last straw came one afternoon when I found James sitting on the steps, fighting tears. I asked what happened, and he told me Karen had yelled at him for leaving his robot arm outside. "She said it was garbage, Dad," he whispered, looking down. "She said I should keep broken things where no one has to look at them." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about neighborhood rules or visual order. This was discrimination. This was cruelty. And I was done giving it space to grow. What I didn't know then was that justice was already in motion, and that Karen had just crossed a federal line she couldn't walk back from. It started with a note, slipped under the door like something out of a bad thriller, printed in bold, capitalized letters. "Please remove all medical equipment from public. If you." There was no signature, no HOA letterhead, just those words. I knew immediately where it came from. Karen had made her feelings about my son's prosthetic arm clear in her passive-aggressive comments and forced smiles since day one, but now she was escalating. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone else in the neighborhood thought it was an issue. Maybe someone tripped on something. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But then came the second note, this time taped directly to the porch railing with bright red tape. "Not a storage zone. Remove artificial limbs from community spaces." That wasn't just cold. It was malicious. I called the HOA to file a complaint and demand answers. The response? A vague, robotic email from the board secretary saying, "All members are expected to maintain visual harmony in shared spaces. No mention of the ADA. No concern for the fact that a child's prosthetic limb was being equated to garbage or yard clutter." They didn't even mention Karen by name. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who was behind it. The neighborhood once, quietly indifferent, began noticing the hostility too. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Fields, pulled me aside after James came home early from the park one day. She said, "I saw her speaking to him. He looked really upset. I couldn't hear everything, but she said something about him being a spectacle." That word sat with me all night. My son, a spectacle. For what? Existing with a disability? Using the tool that gave him independence? Every time I looked at him, smiling, determined, learning how to throw a ball or tie his shoes with one hand and one mechanical limb, I saw nothing but courage. But Karen? She saw disorder. She saw something that didn't fit into her rigid, picture-perfect fantasy of suburban life. The next week, she escalated again, this time with an official violation letter from the HOA board, citing us for improper storage of medical apparatus in plain sight. It referred directly to James's prosthetic arm, which he had left beside the welcome mat while running inside to grab a drink. The letter claimed it was a violation of community aesthetic codes and posed a potential concern for property values. I was stunned, not just by the absurdity, but by the coldness of the language, like his limb was a rusty lawnmower or an old sofa dumped on the curb. I appealed the violation immediately and included a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, highlighting our son's protected rights. The HOA didn't respond for a week. When they did, it was another generic reply, again referencing visual harmony. There was no apology, no recognition of discrimination, no acknowledgement that Karen's actions weren't just cruel, they were illegal. James started to notice the shift. He began hesitating before taking off his prosthetic, asking if he should bring it inside immediately, even when it was hot, even when it hurt. I told him no, that he had every right to rest and feel comfortable in his own home. But I could see the worry in his eyes, the shame. That's what hurt the most. Watching my child, who had fought so hard to adapt, begin to shrink under the weight of someone else's hatred. One evening, as we sat outside enjoying the breeze, Karen walked past, as she always did, clipboard in hand. She paused in front of our house, looked directly at James's arm resting on a towel on the porch, and said loudly, "If your kid needs an arm, maybe keep it inside. Some of us don't need to see that every day." I stood up. Part of me trained for patience, for calm. Almost failed in that moment. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just looked her in the eye and said, "That's his body. That's his life. You don't have to look, but you will respect it." She scoffed and walked away, but I saw it, the flicker of resentment, the unwillingness to back down. It wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, the worst confrontation yet happened. James had just gotten back from school and was sitting on the porch with a juice box, his prosthetic resting beside him. I was inside, just behind the screen door. Karen marched up the path, like she owned the entire block. No knock, no warning. She pointed at the prosthetic and shouted, "I told you this is not a place for broken parts. This isn't a rehab ward." James froze. His hands tightened around the juice box and his mouth opened slightly, but he couldn't form words. I stormed out, rage rising faster than I could contain it. "You talk to my son like that again?" I said, standing between her and James. "And the only thing broken will be your power trip." She backed off, muttering something about calling the HOA and removing violations by force if necessary. By now, neighbors were taking notice. Several witnessed the incident and approached me later with shock and apologies, as if they felt responsible for letting her behavior go unchecked. One even showed me footage from their Ring camera capturing the entire confrontation. I thanked them, but my focus was James. He didn't speak much that evening. He ate quietly, didn't ask for cartoons, didn't even want to play with his Legos. Before bed, he asked, "Is there something wrong with me, Dad?" She said people don't want to look at me. That crushed me. I hugged him tight and told him what every child with a disability should hear. "You are not broken. You are strong. And that arm is proof of how far you've come, not something to hide." That night, I gathered all the footage we had. Our doorbell cam, our neighbor's Ring video, photos of the notes, copies of the HOA letters. And then I remembered something important. Our HOA received federal funding under an inclusive housing development grant. That meant it was legally bound to ADA compliance, and violations could be prosecuted under federal civil rights law. I filed a formal complaint with HUD, submitted all the evidence, and called a contact I had through my former job, someone who now worked in enforcement. It turned out Karen already had multiple complaints on record for discriminatory language and conduct. And now, with footage of her verbally attacking a disabled child and discarding medically necessary equipment, her time was up. I didn't know how fast things would move. I didn't expect justice to knock that fast. But 3 days later, justice didn't knock. It raided. And it came exactly 3 minutes after her final, most disgusting act yet. It was a Thursday afternoon, like any other, bright and warm with that gentle breeze that tells you summer is near. My son, James, came home from school with a slight limp, the kind that told me he'd had a long day wearing his prosthetic. He smiled as he walked up the steps, the kind of tired smile that still manages to be full of light. He carefully took off his prosthetic arm, Titan, as he proudly named it, and laid it down on the porch beside his backpack, just as he always did. It was his routine. The harness rubbed against his shoulder after hours of wear, and he liked to cool down before putting it away. There was nothing unusual about it. It was his space, his home, and in our eyes it was perfectly normal. Until 3 minutes later, when Karen made sure it wasn't. She must have been watching from her window, because she arrived like clockwork, storming across her lawn in that signature-pressed blouse and HOA clipboard clenched under her arm like a gavel. The porch cam caught her approach, her eyes already narrowed, jaw set, steps sharp and angry. James had gone inside to get a juice pouch, unaware that the very thing he depended on, the very tool that made his independence possible, was about to be targeted in the most degrading way. Karen stepped up to our porch, glanced down at the prosthetic like it was roadkill, and muttered something under her breath. Then she bent down, picked up the arm, my son's expensive, medically necessary prosthetic, and stared at it with disgust. The home security audio captured what she said next as she turned toward the garbage bin at the edge of our walkway. "This is trash. This is not a showroom for freaks." And with that, she tossed it in. Not gently. Not carefully. She flung it into the bin like it was broken furniture or a piece of junk mail. The sound of metal hitting plastic rang out with a violent clang. She dusted off her hands like she'd done the neighborhood a favor, muttered something about restoring, "Order!" and marched away as if what she had done was completely justified. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She didn't hesitate. Just invaded my property, grabbed a piece of my son's body, and threw it away. I had heard stories of hate. I'd seen injustice. But this was beyond cruelty. It was dehumanizing. I was in the kitchen when I heard the noise and stepped outside just in time to see Karen's back disappearing across the lawn. James was standing frozen at the doorway, eyes wide, looking past me at the empty spot on the porch. "Dad, where's Titan?" he asked. I turned my head, then sprinted toward the garbage bin, flipping open the lid like a man possessed. There. It was our 18,000 prosthetic arm, crammed between a pizza box and yard clippings, covered in grime, twisted awkwardly. I pulled it out with shaking hands, heart racing, fury burning through me like a fuse that had finally reached the end. I didn't say a word. I walked inside, grabbed my laptop, and opened the secure upload portal for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Then I opened my direct contact line to the ADA compliance officer I had spoken with only days earlier. I attached the video file, wrote a brief summary. Immediate violent ADA violation caught on tape. Repeat offender. Child targeted. Request urgent enforcement action. I hit send, not expecting anything to happen quickly. But what I didn't know was that Karen's name had already been flagged. Multiple complaints had been quietly stacking up. This wasn't her first time skirting the line of hate. It was just the first time she had been caught doing it with irrefutable, time-stamped, high-definition evidence. And now, with that single video clip and my official submission, everything came crashing down. 3 minutes later, just three, two unmarked black SUVs rolled up to her house like a precision strike. I didn't even have time to refresh my email before I saw them pull in, doors swinging open, boots hitting the pavement with controlled urgency. Federal Marshals. They didn't knock politely, they didn't ask nicely, they had a warrant, they had probable cause, and they had seen enough. One went to the front door, another looped around to the side entrance. Within seconds, they were inside. Neighbors came out to watch, phones in hand, jaws slack with shock. Karen was led out in handcuffs, her lips moving frantically, but her words drowned out by the whirl of squad radios and flashing red lights. She kept saying, "I didn't know, it was just garbage. I didn't mean..." But the footage said otherwise. The law said otherwise. Her long list of previous complaints said otherwise. James stood beside me, clutching Titan close to his chest. His eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with relief. The kind of relief that comes when the world finally sees what you've been enduring, when someone finally stands up and says, "Enough." I put my arm around him, pulled him close, and said, "She's not going to hurt anyone again." The marshals stayed for nearly an hour, collecting items, speaking with witnesses, and seizing HOA documents. Apparently, Karen had been misusing her authority for years, issuing fake violations, targeting disabled and elderly residents, and doctoring records to cover it all up. The federal housing funds tied to our development made her behavior a federal offense. And now there was no hiding behind her title, her clipboard, or her smug smile. She had crossed the line, and she had done it in front of a camera. That day wasn't just an incident. It was a reckoning. For Karen, for the neighborhood, for every silent victim who had been too afraid to speak. And for James, it was the day he saw that he was worth defending. That his body, his dignity, his strength, they mattered. And no one, not even a self-righteous HOA tyrant, had the power to take that from him ever again. The hours that followed Karen's arrest felt surreal, like stepping out of a nightmare only to find yourself blinking in a strange, silent calm. The neighborhood was stunned. Some watched from their windows as the federal marshals loaded boxes from her home into black SUVs. Others stood on their porches, clutching coffee mugs, whispering to spouses as if saying it aloud would make it real. For so long, Karen had walked these streets like a self-appointed sheriff, ruling with fear, humiliation, and manufactured violations. Now she was gone, cuffed and escorted by people who didn't care about her clipboard or the number of years. She'd sat on the HOA board. But what truly shocked people wasn't the fact that she had finally crossed a line. It was how quickly the system responded. 3 minutes. That's all it took. Because what she didn't know, what most in the neighborhood never realized, was that our HOA, while local in practice, was tied to a federally subsidized inclusive housing grant, one designed to promote accessible, non-discriminatory living for residents with disabilities. That meant any violation, especially one as violent and targeted as trashing a disabled child's prosthetic, was not just offensive, it was federal. And when that line was crossed on camera, with a pattern of documented complaints to back it up, the ADA protocols activated. What Karen had done wasn't simply vandalism or harassment, it was, under federal law, a civil rights violation. By targeting James's prosthetic, by tossing it away like trash, by mocking his disability with cruel intent, she had committed a hate-based act that triggered legal consequences beyond the HOA's control. The footage I submitted through the HUD enforcement portal wasn't the first they'd received involving Karen. It was simply the one they could no longer ignore. For years, she had received quiet complaints, most of which had been brushed aside by the HOA board as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. But those records hadn't disappeared. They had been archived, quietly growing into a paper trail of abuse. My submission was the final nail, the undeniable proof of targeted discrimination, the kind of proof that doesn't wait for a court date. It brings a badge and a warrant. Karen was formally charged within 48 hours. Among the charges, civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, destruction of federally protected medical property, and discrimination within a federally funded housing association. As the news broke, our small suburb became a national headline. Outlets from across the country ran stories. Federal Marshals arrest HOA president in shocking disability discrimination case. Interviews were requested. Footage went viral. People were outraged, not just because of what she did, but because so many had seen people like her get away with similar behavior for years. It wasn't just our family that found validation. Across the country, families with disabled children, veterans with prosthetics, and individuals with visible differences began sharing their stories. Stories of being told they didn't fit, the neighborhood aesthetic, of being asked to hide their conditions, of being treated like problems instead of people. In our neighborhood, the atmosphere changed overnight. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, the first of its kind to be open to the entire community. For the first time, people spoke without fear. Retired residents admitted they had been fined for using mobility scooters. One young mother said, Karen had once demanded she relocate her son's sensory swing because it looked like circus equipment. A veteran with a service dog revealed that Karen had repeatedly threatened eviction unless he replaced the animal with a quieter breed. These weren't isolated incidents. Karen hadn't just targeted us. She had targeted anyone who didn't match her warped ideal of suburban normalcy, and no one had stopped her. Until now. James's prosthetic was repaired and sanitized the same day, thanks to an emergency request, to the manufacturer. When we brought it back to him, he looked at it for a long moment, then said softly, "She didn't break, Titan. He's still mine." That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay. He wore it proudly the next day, waving to every neighbor who passed. They waved back, many for the first time, with genuine smiles, kind words, and apologies that we knew came from the heart. Some brought cards, others brought cookies, but more importantly, they brought change. Policies were reviewed. A new HOA leadership election was held. The board voted unanimously to undergo ADA compliance training and consult with disability rights advocates moving forward. As for Karen, she faced the full weight of federal prosecution. Her home was seized during the investigation. Her name, once synonymous with power on our street, was now tied to shame in national discourse. And though she claimed in court that it was a misunderstanding, the footage, the history, and the intent behind her words told another story, one the world no longer chose to ignore. The aftermath wasn't just about her downfall, it was about something far more powerful: visibility, accountability, and justice for every child who's ever been made to feel ashamed for who they are. Karen threw away more than a prosthetic arm that day. She threw away her humanity, and the system, finally, was ready to answer back. Justice came not with fury, but with precision, the kind of slow, deliberate inevitability that doesn't just punish wrongdoing, but exposes every layer of rot hiding beneath the surface. After Karen's arrest, the federal investigation moved quickly because the evidence was not only overwhelming, it was undeniable. The home surveillance footage of her throwing my son's prosthetic arm in the trash became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Her voice, clearly captured, calling it junk and referring to James as a freak, made her intent unmistakable. The ADA investigators, working through HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, unsealed records of prior complaints filed against her, many dismissed or ignored by the local HOA board, but none forgotten in the federal database. Over a dozen formal grievances had been submitted over the years, most from elderly or disabled residents, detailing behavior that now read like a pattern: verbal harassment, refusal to accommodate mobility devices, punitive fines for accessibility, ramps, even threatening letters to parents of autistic children who disrupted the harmony of the block. Her pattern of conduct wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment. It was a systemic abuse of power, and the DOJ treated it accordingly. Karen was formally indicted on multiple federal charges: willful violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, destruction of protected medical property, targeted harassment of a minor, and abuse of authority under a federally subsidized housing program. During her arraignment, she pled not guilty, her attorney claiming it was a misunderstanding and blaming stress from HOA responsibilities. But the prosecutors weren't buying it, and neither was the court. The weight of the evidence crushed any attempt at defense. The video clips, audio recordings, written notices, and previous testimonies painted a picture not of a stressed homeowner, but of a woman who had spent years waging war against anyone who didn't fit her rigid view of normal. Her clipboard, once her weapon of choice, was now Exhibit A in a federal hate crime case. The trial became a national story, with media outlets following each development. Disability rights advocates showed up to support us and other victims who finally felt empowered to speak. Former neighbors testified. One woman shared how Karen told her to move her cancer treatments out of sight because the portable oxygen machine ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic. A war veteran recounted being fined for leaving his prosthetic leg on the porch after mowing the lawn. The courtroom was full of quiet outrage, each story layering more proof that this wasn't just one terrible act. It was the climax of years of unchecked cruelty. And the jury saw it for what it was. After only a few hours of deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift. Karen was stripped of her position on the HOA, permanently banned from serving on any community board, and ordered to pay damages to multiple victims, including James. But more significantly, she received a federal prison sentence of 7 years, without parole. Her defense tried to plea for leniency, citing age, mental health, and lack of prior convictions, but the judge didn't flinch. In his ruling, he stated, "This case is not just about one act of malice. It is about a sustained campaign of dehumanization against vulnerable individuals carried out under the guise of community leadership." Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer smug, no longer composed. Her reign of control, silence, and fear was over. Beyond the courtroom, real change began to unfold. Our community implemented new regulations requiring all HOA board members to undergo ADA compliance training. HUD released a national memo reinforcing the enforcement of federal protections in HOA-run neighborhoods. And perhaps most meaningfully, Congress began reviewing legislation to expand ADA protections in private residential communities with public funding, a movement that disability rights groups began calling Titan's Law, named after James's prosthetic arm. What Karen meant to demean, the world turned into a symbol of strength. As for our family, we found peace not in her punishment, but in knowing we stood up. Not just for our son, but for everyone she tried to silence. James, once afraid to wear his prosthetic outside, now wears it with pride. Kids at school call him Titan now, not because of what he lost, but because of what he represents. Strength, resilience, justice. And while we'll never forget the pain she caused, we also won't forget what came next. A rare but powerful moment where the system worked, where truth prevailed, and where the world made it clear that no child, especially one fighting so hard to thrive, will ever be considered trash. Not on our watch, not ever again. In the quiet weeks that followed the trial, after the news coverage faded and the neighborhood returned to its slower, more cautious rhythm, I found myself reflecting not just on what had happened, but on what it revealed, about our communities, our responsibilities, and our silence. My son's prosthetic arm, the very tool that gave him freedom and confidence, was reduced to trash by someone who saw difference as disorder and disability as something to be hidden. Karen didn't just throw away a piece of plastic and metal. She tried to discard my son's dignity, his identity, his right to be seen. And yet in doing so, she revealed something far more dangerous than ignorance. The quiet, insidious way cruelty hides behind rules. How people weaponize systems meant to protect us, and how communities often look the other way when that cruelty is polite, organized, or wrapped in bureaucracy. That's the real message here. What happened to us wasn't just about a single act of hate. It was about all the ignored warning signs that led up to it. The muttered comments, the passive-aggressive notes, the way no one spoke up until it was too late. And if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that small cruelties are never small. They are signals, early symptoms of something festering beneath the surface. We ignore them at our own risk. What saved my son wasn't just the law, it was documentation, vigilance, and an unwillingness to stay quiet. I recorded everything. I kept every note, every email, every second of camera footage. And in the end, it was that evidence that tipped the scale toward justice. If you're a parent, especially of a child with a disability, I urge you, protect them not just with love, but with evidence. Keep records. Advocate loudly. Don't assume someone will come around or doesn't mean it that way, because sometimes they do. And when they act with the confidence that no one will stop them. But the other side of this reflection is hope, because in standing up, we weren't alone. Our neighbors eventually came forward. Strangers across the country reached out. Law enforcement took it seriously. The law worked. And my son, who once asked me if he should hide his robot arm so people don't have to look at it, now wears it proudly, knowing it's not just a tool for his body, but a symbol of everything he overcame. I want every child like James to know you are not broken. You do not need to shrink. You do not need to hide who you are to make others comfortable. And to every adult who witnesses cruelty, no matter how small, say something. Do something. Because silence isn't neutral. It protects the wrong people. Let this story be a reminder. Dignity is not negotiable, and no child deserves to fight for their humanity on their own front porch. If this story moved you, angered you, or made you pause and think, don't let it end here. What happened to my son wasn't just an isolated act of cruelty. It's a reflection of something much larger, how society still fails to protect the most vulnerable among us when prejudice hides behind rules and policies. If you've ever seen injustice, if you've ever experienced discrimination, or if you know someone who has been made to feel less than for being different, now is the time to speak up. Share this story, not for clicks, but to raise awareness. Share it so others know that what starts with a note on the door can escalate into something life-altering. And if you have a story of courage, survival, or injustice, drop it in the comments. We're building a space here where every voice matters, where silence doesn't win, and where community means protection, not control. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in justice, in truth, and in creating a world where every child, every family, and every human being is treated with dignity. This isn't just content, it's a movement. Let's make sure the next Karen is held accountable before someone else gets hurt. Let's be the difference.